Well, let's return to our top story, the sudden departure of the last two reporters for Australian media outlets in China. And that has many wondering just how much lower our diplomatic relationship with Beijing can fall. Joining me now is John Blaxland, Professor of International Security and Intelligence Studies at the ANU. John, quite a significant day in this relationship between our two countries. Do you get the sense that China's really just trying to blow up its relationship with Australia?
No, I don't think so. It still values the relationship. It still has, it's still very much a relationship of mutual benefit. But there is a degree of leverage that it feels it still can exercise in a sense of, in a punitive way, to punish us for daring to basically cross them and to operate in a way that is seen as not being in the way that President Xi would like us to behave. And so this kind of behaviour, the response from China is not all that surprising. And let's not forget, it follows on from the dismissal and the expulsion of a number of US journalists. And there's really not that many other Western syndicated journalists left in Beijing from English-speaking countries anyway. We know, for instance, that Canada has, I think, 2 or 3 left, and they must be fairly nervous as well, because Canada is facing similar kinds of pressures over the issue of the Huawei senior executive who's been detained by Canada for extradition to the United States. So it's not just us, but this is the latest manifestation. I'd bring to your attention also, Bev, that there's fighting going on the line of actual control between India and China at the moment. So this is just another manifestation of a fairly assertive and belligerent approach from President Xi, which raises a lot of questions about what on earth is motivating him to behave this way. What is it about the internal dynamics of China that are driving this kind of paranoid behaviour and this kind of bully boy behaviour? And it is quite disconcerting, but I think we need to keep it in perspective. They need us. They need the trade. There is a degree of leeway still for that to happen, but not necessarily too much. And of course, what do we do in response? Now, interesting, there's a question, and people like to blame one side of politics or the other. My concern is that, look, you've got a chicken and an egg, and you can go before the chicken to another egg. So you can track back, but we have to deal with the situation we face today. And what we face today is a fairly belligerent Chinese government that is looking to punish Australia. How do we respond? I think it's very important we play with a straight bat, and that we play, to a certain extent, the game that they're playing with us. The question then, I think, needs to be asked of the Chinese embassy here in Canberra, and it could be politely put to them: should we be doing this to your journalists here in Canberra? What other measures should we be doing to restrict your freedom of action here in Canberra and in Australia more broadly? Now, not that that's something we want to bring about, but the bottom line is that we do have agency, we have leverage, and in addition, we're looked to by our neighbours. They are actually quietly, kind of cheering us on, because what Australia does is it sets a precedent for others in the neighbourhood. And I'm not talking here about the Quad so much, although that is certainly a factor, particularly India and Japan, but also the Southeast Asian states that look to Australia, not because they want to publicly point that out, but what Australia does is a very important precedent-setting action and behaviour that allows them to operate short of that. And that's a very important precedent for Australia, and it's very important that when we think about what Australia does in response to the circumstances we face, that it has a ripple effect in the neighbourhood.
Okay, let me unpick that though, because there's 2 points I want to get more response from on you. Is if China doesn't hold all the cards, what cards do we hold to try and respond to this without getting a disproportionate response back, which seems to be what China's response is at the moment? And how does understanding what's going on internally in China help us manage this relationship?
So not having an ABC journalist in Beijing certainly makes it more difficult. We're now relying more than ever on the age-old practice of diplomacy. Our diplomats in Beijing are more important than ever. You know, once upon a time we thought, oh, do we really need that many diplomats? You can get your news off the internet, you can Google it all. Well, of course, we now have, in the case of China, our most important trading partner, a massive firewall, a firewall that prevents us from being able to peer into China effectively, and for us to communicate our messages into China, and for people in China to be able to communicate effectively back out. So it is really problematic.
So you talk about the important economic relationship between our two countries. What leverage do we have to sort of let China know that they still need us as much as we need them?
So it's not just us. I mean, clearly, you know, they need our iron ore. I mean, as you know, we've made this point before, Bev, but they don't buy from us because they like our liberal Western democracy. They do so because they consider it a good deal. And so we need to be very sober-minded about the rationale for their purchasing our goods. If they find a better deal elsewhere, they will go for it. And they will probably couch it in terms of punishing Australia. But it won't be because of punishment. It'll be because of the economics of the deal. China's very, very pragmatic about this, and we need to be pragmatic about it as well. But in addition, we have a number, I mean, people, you know, it's easy to fixate on the trade with China, in part because we've disaggregated the trade with everybody else. China does stand out statistically on the graphs, but when you aggregate the others, it still is a fraction. It is not it's not everything. And so particularly on a whole range of different goods, China is not the only player on the field. And the other one, very interesting when you think about options, the Australian Foreign Policy White Paper of 2017, what I like to call Australia's Foreign Policy Plan B, was all about reaching out to all of these other countries that are similarly uncomfortable with what China's saying and doing, but they don't want to be too loud, they don't want to be too assertive, because they don't want to get the opprobrium of China. We are one step further physically removed, geographically removed from China, but we're also the closest US ally in the neighbourhood. And this is where, while there are critics of the alliance out there, people need to remember that the alliance gives us enormous leverage in the neighbourhood, and it gives us enormous leverage in terms of our position with China, because the United States is our ally. And even though some might say, oh, you know, the United States is not that certain anymore, the bottom line is there's a certain ambiguity about what the United States may do in support of Australia. And that weighs on the Chinese minds, and it also is on the minds of our neighbours in Southeast Asia, who are all, they have similar sort of trading imbalances with China. They're also wanting to develop cross-pollination and cross-developing trading partners with each other. And that's a very important aspect of what we can do, reinforcing those trade ties with our Southeast Asian partners, with India, with Europe, with Japan, with North America, with South America, and beyond, Africa as well. So we have options. Now, what this message, and this is the Foreign Policy Plan B, which we now need to double down on, didn't seem so urgent before, but the dismissal of Mike Smith and Bill Birtles really does ram home that we face an urgent need to diversify. Yep. Diversify our student body, diversify our trading pool, and diversify our network and build on that. And this gets to another point, Bev, and we've talked about this before too, the importance of diplomacy. We've undercooked our diplomacy in Australia in the last few years. We've undercooked our relationship with our neighbours in Southeast Asia and in the Pacific. And, you know, we talked about the Grand Compact for the Pacific. That's still needed. We need a similar kind of close collaborative relationship with our neighbours in Southeast Asia, particularly with Indonesia, with whom we've just signed a comprehensive economic partnership agreement, and which is also suffering severely from COVID-19. These are countries that need help. Australia has still got some spare capacity to bolster goodwill, to do something genuinely helpful, and to actually help bolster security and stability in our neighbourhood in a way that actually gives us more options, more strength and more ballast, if you like, in terms of our relationship with the big dragon up the hill.
Indeed. John, as always, thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you, Bev.